Charles, I am Church of Scotland. However, I spend most of my time debating and discussing current affairs in the company of Catholics. When I'm not told directly, I certainly often feel there's a fair level of vitriol towards people of my denomination from devout Catholics, even when we share the same views concerning monarchy, history, and politics. Why do so many trad Catholics actively choose to be so condescending and nose in the air towards those of slightly different Christian backgrounds? Does this perhaps speak to some of the reason why the Catholic faith, at least on the outside, appears to be so divided and unable to press forward in a unified sense?
Well, firstly, let me apologize on behalf of my co-religionists to any slights you may have received. But now I'll explain to you why you've gotten them and why it's particularly difficult with your being in the Church of Scotland. The reason is simple. In the British Isles, Catholics are a bit like the American Indians here, or rather there in the United States, in the sense that ours was the old religion and it was displaced. We were defeated. We had 2 centuries of the penal laws. We lost everything. And everywhere we go, we are reminded constantly of being the losers. You can't go, take Edinburgh, St. Giles Cathedral. That was a Catholic church. You take any of the oldest churches in Scotland or England or Ireland, they're all in Protestant hands, and they were ours. And in Scotland, in particular, they were denuded of their contents in nasty, nasty ways. I'd invite you to study the life of St. John Ogilvie, who was the only canonized Scots martyr thus far of the Reformation, so-called. The other thing you've got to know is that the founder of the Church of Scotland, John Knox, is a particularly offensive character for us because he was the architect of ultimately, of the downfall and then the murder of Mary Queen of Scots, who, for many of us Catholics, is something of a heroine. So that's all there in the background. And also bear in mind that in Britain especially, although most of the inhibitions against us have been gradually lifted, still can't be king. The king could be a Hindu, but he couldn't be a Catholic. So that's why, and of course the Church of Scotland is the established Church of Scotland. Now, as you know, the Queen, although not the head of the Church of Scotland, the same way that she's the head of the Church of England, is nevertheless the major layperson in the Church of Scotland. So Her Majesty and the members of the royal family are Anglicans south of the border and Presbyterians north of the border. Now, to the Catholic mind, that just seems utterly mad. And part and parcel of what we see as the basically corrosive ethos of Protestantism in general. Also, as I say, we're constantly reminded of the history of the thing. I'll give you an example of myself with my nose in the air, and you'll understand what I mean. Until the 19th century, at Christmas, the Pope would bless a crown and a sword, which he would send to a deserving Catholic soldier. Sometimes the soldier would be in Rome, often it'd be a king or something that would have to send it to him. Well, it so happened that Pope Alexander VI gave James IV this particular gift. And as a result, the sword that he blessed at Christmas and gave James IV was incorporated into the Scottish crown jewels, and it's now the sword of state. And the scabbard still has the tiara and keys on it. And it's been used at every Scots coronation down to Charles I. All right. So the honors of Scotland, as they're called, are on exhibit at Edinburgh Castle. And I went there with a friend of mine, an Irish friend named Rory O'Hanlon, from County Monaghan, where O'Hanlons tend to come from. and we went to go see it. Well, there was a line of people in front of us, and this one Scotsman right in front of me looked at the sword of state, and he saw the papal tiara and keys on the scabbard, and he made the most disgusted look. And he said, "What's that there for, then?" And I said, ever helpful, I believe I can answer that question, sir. And I said, you see, before John Knox sold your country to the English, this was a Catholic nation. That was a gift of the Pope to James IV. So he didn't look very happy, and he went off. And afterwards, Rory looks at me and says, you really know how to make friends up here. I said, well. Then that same day, we went to Holyrood. And Holyrood, of course, for those who don't know, was the longtime residence of Scottish kings and remains the Edinburgh residence of Her Majesty. Well, there was a painting on the tour of Her Majesty after her coronation in England, basically confronted with the honours of Scotland at St. Giles Cathedral as a sort of inauguration rite of some kind. And the group were looking at this, and one person, and it was noted that she was wearing sort of a nice blue dress, but nothing official. And someone asked about that, and the tour guide, she was very good, she said, well, there was some mention of this at the time, that the ceremony was so much less formal than what happened in Westminster Abbey. And one Scotsman said, why don't we have our own coronation then? And the tour guide said, I don't really know. And I said, I believe I can answer that question. And at this point, Rory, really wanted to hide his head in shame, but he didn't. He was a good sport about it. And I said, you've got to understand that unlike Anglican or Catholic theology, Calvinist theology has absolutely no room for a sacramental rite like the coronation. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't have a bishop in the Church of Scotland today. And you certainly wouldn't have anointing, because it simply doesn't square with Calvinist theology at all. The whole concept isn't there. So I said, that's why. And I got a lot of unpleasant looks, I don't mind telling you. But it was true, and they knew it was true, and nobody could say anything. So, to answer your question, Catholics are people too, and they tend to react the way people do. As far as regards the last element of the question, you've got to bear in mind that since the Vatican Council, there has been an enormous fight within the Church amongst, for want of a better word, I could call it a Protestantizing element and an anti-Protestantizing element. And as is often the case, the anti-Protestantizing element, especially because they, apart from Pope Benedict XVI and some people like that, at the moment are not the majority of the leadership. Its members are very much like damaged kids. When I lived through the Great Revolution, you see, and it wasn't pleasant. And had I not had a French-Canadian father with a World War II sense of humor, I probably would be quite as bitter as any bitter old trad can be. But it didn't happen that way. So, Ross, I can tell you again, I'm very, very sorry that you've been put in that position. But again, it's a bit like, as I say, it's like our own American Indians. They have kind of a chip on their shoulder. But if you examine the history, it's not entirely unwarranted.